Tragedy, January 15th, 1947. The day began as any other day does. The birds were chirping and the sky was clear and sunny, despite a cold temperature of 31 degrees. Countless people were out on their morning walks. However, for a lady named Betty Bersinger, this walk would be anything but normal. While walking along the undeveloped lots in Leimert Park, she noticed what at first glance appeared to be a mannequin, until she got closer. What she saw was one of the most horrific and soon-to-be infamous murders in the history of the United States. Lifelessly staring back at her was the recently deceased Elizabeth Short. And before we continue the mystery at hand, let's talk a little bit about Elizabeth, or Betty as she prefers to be called. Over the years, she has been riddled with an exorbitant amount of misinformation. You see, if you read articles about her or watch YouTube videos, you are going to hear so many ridiculous things. You most likely hear that Betty was a girl that loved to party, that she dated a mobster, that she dabbled in prostitution, and she was last seen at the Cecil Hotel. You'll also hear that she was a lesbian, her middle name was Anne, hell, even the name of the origin, the Black Dahlia, which is often said to have come from the press to sell more paper, is completely false, as we'll get to later. As you can probably tell, most of, if not all of these fabrications that are still believed to be true to this day, came from the yellow journalism of the 40s. You see, back in the 1940s, well, hell, even today in some cases, a practice known as yellow journalism was widely used, and it involved highly exaggerated headlines in order to increase their sales, and often featured no ounces of effort in their research. In this case, the blame predominantly falls to the William Randolph Hearst-owned Los Angeles Examiner and the Herald Express, although most newspapers at the time also covered the murder extensively. See, in 1947, there were 4 major papers, all fighting for readers in Los Angeles. There was the LA Times, the Examiner, the Herald Express, and the Daily News. The fairly conservative Times and the Examiner were the morning edition papers. The Herald Express was published in the afternoon, and the Daily News was a cheap tabloid paper that published at all times of the day. The Examiner and Herald Express both greatly emphasized crime, often to a sensational degree. The Times most ignored the crime, and Daily News posted garbage nonsense constantly. The Examiner was the largest of all 4 papers and the most morally dubious, for reasons we will get to. The Herald Express is one of the key reasons why people assume this was the work of a serial killer, because they constantly made comparisons to other murders at the time. But the Examiner was definitely the paper most associated with the Black Dahlia. The paper more or less ran its own investigation and played a key role in the discovery of evidence and a key suspect, along with other less helpful information. As a direct result of the actions taken by the Examiner, Herald Express, and other smaller papers, people believed the many falsehoods that were reported, and later on, various works of fiction would draw inspiration from these falsehoods, creating even more lies. Even more lies were intentionally or not spread by people writing articles, videos, or books decades down the road inspired by that same false information. Even the best intentions often fail because virtually all the books on the subject are drawing from this false information, so unless you live in LA, you're at the mercy of decades of bad research. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. With all that being said, though, now let me tell you guys what Betty Short was really like. Born on July 29th, 1924, Betty's short life in many ways was pretty tragic. Her early life was spent in Medford, Massachusetts, and when she was just 5 years old, her family was struck by the Great Depression, as many Americans were. Her father built miniature golf courses for a living, but in 1930 that business was completely squashed, and her father subsequently abandoned them. To make matters even worse, she also suffered from asthma, prompting her to move to Florida at the age of 16 to escape the harsh winters of Massachusetts. This would be her first time moving in a life that would be full of constant moving. Unlike what articles stated about her personality, she was described by a multitude of people, such as neighbors and actresses, as being a pretty and nice girl who was well-behaved and innocent, which contradicts most articles already, which painted her as this party-goer. The worst that could be said is that she was sometimes a tease. Anyways, eventually her father, Cleo Short, would return, sending her some money, and she subsequently moved in with him in California. However, their relationship was never close, as she was out of the house more often than not, before moving back to Florida in 1944, following an arrest, and she ended up falling in love with Major Matthew Martin Gordon Jr., who was in the United States Army Air Force and was tragically killed just a year later after a plane crash. That is, of course, if you believe her version of the events, but again, we'll get to that. In 1946, she would move to LA after meeting another pilot in Florida, Lieutenant Joseph Gordon Fickling, and during these last few months, her situations were quite sporadic, as there were 3 confirmed places she lived in this time span. There was a rented place at 6024 Carlos Ave under the name Mark Hansen, who you'll hear about more later. There was the Hawthorne Hotel on Orange Drive and the Chancellor Apartments at 1842 North Cherokee, which, as a side note, is the only location that is still standing all these years later. These sporadic living conditions are a result of her being unemployed during this entire span of her life. She more or less lived off the kindness of strangers. This again contradicts a popular part of the lore, which is the fact that she was a waitress at this time. This is also where the ultra-famous nickname Black Dahlia came from, despite what once again is rumored to be true. It's commonly believed that she earned this nickname due to the press, but it actually was conceived at a drugstore Betty used to frequent in Long Beach. Customers would often call her the Black Dahlia due to how she wore her hair and because of the popular 1946 noir film, The Blue Dahlia. The original working name popular in the papers was the Werewolf Murder due to the brutal nature, but instead, Black Dahlia caught on like wildfire and the press took all the credit. Towards the end, she took a trip to San Diego and ended up moving into the household of the French family, and they described her again as never staying in the home. She was always out and about. During one of her times out, she met a man named Robert Red Manley, who she got along great with, and who even offered her a job interview, which she would never attend. After getting kicked out of the French family's home, she went to Manley, who drove her back to LA and dropped her off at the Biltmore Hotel late on January 9th, and what would be the last time anyone saw her alive. For 6 days, she was unaccounted for until the morning of the 15th. Now, if I can describe Betty as a person, I would say she was tragic and confusing. Nearly everyone who knew her described her as being very well-mannered and an overall good person, but due to her financial situation throughout her entire life, especially towards the end, she would often lie in order to gain sympathy out of people. For example, while she claimed Matthew Gordon was the love of her life, his family claims Betty made up the whole love story. Another lie was the famous myth of her being a wannabe film starlet. Despite reportedly telling her mother, Phoebe, it's likely that she lied about wanting to be a film star since there was no evidence of her ever attending casting calls or anything of the sort. It is still entirely possible she wanted to be an actress, however, even if this was true, it was not the root cause of her moving to LA like it's often claimed to be. While these actions are morally questionable, I wouldn't call her a bad person or anything, I'd call her a tragic one. And speaking of tragedy, it's time to go back to that day. January 15th, 1947. As stated before, she was spotted in an undeveloped lot in South Norton Avenue, where she was drained of blood and resembled a mannequin more than a human. The most disturbing part? She was cut into 2 pieces between the second and third lumbar vertebrae, and the cut was so clean that not a single internal organ was even touched, suggesting that this could have only been done by a skilled surgeon. Her arms, legs, and neck all featured ligature marks, indicating that she was tied down. Death had been brought on by multiple lacerations to her face after being knocked unconscious by repeated blows to the head. The mutilation occurred after she passed away. She was also heavily washed, and as such, no fingerprints could be found, a key reason why this mystery has lasted to this day. Betty was identified by law enforcement after matching her fingerprints with the prints taken following her arrest in 1943. After the identification, Betty's mother, Phoebe, had to be informed of what happened to her child. Unfortunately, the LAPD were not the ones to break it to her. It was the Examiner. Rewrite man Wayne Sutton and city editor Jimmy Richardson called Phoebe and told her that Betty had won a beauty contest. They prodded her for information about Betty until they felt she wasn't giving anything useful. They then bluntly told Phoebe her daughter hadn't won anything. She was dead. One other strange event worth noting was that 10 days after the investigation, the Examiner was mailed some of Betty's personal belongings, which included her social security card, birth certificate, and an old address book with some missing pages that belonged to the aforementioned Mark Hansen. All other letters sent in were deemed hoaxes by the LAPD. No fingerprints were retrieved from the letter. So now that we have a background of who Betty was as a person, and now that we've explained the condition of the body, what we're going to do is just jump right into the suspects. Since this is such a famous case, there have been literally over 100 suspects listed throughout the years. So we're going to heavily narrow it down to include the most popular suspects, and obviously, we will include what we think is the most likely suspect. So, without further ado, let's dive in. The first suspect we must talk about is Robert Manley, who we mentioned earlier. If you don't remember, Manley was the very last person with her, as he was the man that dropped Betty off at the Biltmore, and as such, he has always been a very popular suspect in this case. But was Manley actually behind this? Well, let's first look at who Robert Manley actually was. There isn't a ton of info available about Manley, but we do know that he was in the military and was actually discharged due to mental illness. Because of this and the fact that he hooked up with Betty, it's easy to understand why he was such a popular suspect. And when investigators found out about this information, they ran a polygraph test on him, which he passed. Although it's worth noting that early polygraphs were primitive as hell and couldn't be used in court anyway. Jumping way forward to the 50s, he was committed to a mental hospital where for one final time they ran another test on him to see if he was truly behind this case after all. And once again, it was proven that he was not. Apparently, these never-ending suspicions on whether or not he was the suspect of this case really destroyed Manley mentally, who was already an unstable man. So, while he had a troubling past and was the last person that Betty interacted with, he was absolutely not the person behind this case. Consider this one debunked. The next suspect that we felt the need to shed some light on was Mark Hansen, who was another guy that we mentioned previously. Mark Hansen was the business manager of the Florentine Gardens nightclub. The Danish-born businessman also ran quite a few second-run theaters in the LA area, such as the Mark Hall, and was famously shy and private. The reason he became a suspect was because of the items sent to the Examiner 10 days after the event, which, as we stated, contained an address book owned by Hansen himself. We also specified that Betty actually stayed at Mark Hansen's place for a little while, which was something that left us confused for a little bit, but not much was actually known about their relationship at all, until Jiff emailed Larry Harnish, who cleared things up. He logically answered the question, reminding us that this was very soon after World War II and America was under a housing crisis. Therefore, people taking others in wasn't actually too uncommon, and this was just one of those situations. Betty actually lived with Hansen on 2 separate occasions as well, where 2 different moments of friction caused her to move out. Originally, Betty and a friend lived with Hansen, but Hansen apparently did not like her friend, which caused both of them to move out. Her friend eventually left Hollywood, but Betty moved back to Hansen's place as she had nowhere else to go. This second stint was again short-lived, though as after some sort of dispute, Betty moved out again, where she went to the aforementioned Chancellor Apartments, and finally, San Diego. Overall, they didn't have nearly as complex of a relationship as initially thought, as these types of situations were actually more common than previously thought. Hansen was married at the time, but this didn't stop him from flirting with various women, possibly including Betty, but it didn't go any further than that. Again though, it's easy to see why he is such a popular suspect, but is he truly the man that did it? Definitely not. Hansen had absolutely no criminal record at all in his entire lifetime, despite what is often claimed. There's this very popular rumor out there that he was affiliated with organized crime in LA, but this wasn't true at all, as according to the police chief, these crime groups were very tribal. For example, one of them was Sicilian and the other was Jewish. Mark was neither of the above, so he would have never been trusted. So he was not an associate of such people like Mickey Cohen, Jack Dragna, and Bugsy Siegel. He also didn't have the necessary medical skills required to mutilate her body. Hansen's life was very much shaken up by Betty's death. That and an attempted murder by a striptease girl in 1949. Overall, Hansen is again easily debunked, but our next guy here rose to infamy for supposedly knowing about Betty through Hansen, and his name is Leslie Dillon. Leslie Dillon has one of the most interesting cases out of anybody, being that he actually contacted the LAPD himself, and he lived in Florida and not LA. The reason he contacted them was because he was an aspiring writer who was fascinated by the case after reading it. All we know about him from his life before this case was that he was a bellhop and, at one point, worked as a mortician's assistant for 3 weeks in Oklahoma City. He drove the ambulance for those 3 weeks for the record. Many people say that he was a morgue attendant, but this is not true. When contacting the LAPD, he would often have exchanges with a psychologist named Paul DeRiver, and during their exchange, Dillon said that he believed his friend Jeff Connors was actually responsible for this death. Eventually, this psychologist started believing that Connors never even existed, and Leslie actually created him in his head to cope with what he had done. DeRivers managed to trick Dillon into meeting him, leading to a long interrogation in which Dillon was treated very harshly. It's worth noting that DeRiver had a rather poor reputation in history prior to this event. He was not the most reliable of people. For about a day, it looked like the case was solved, but instead of confessing, Dillon sued. This led to a long public court trial which cleared him of any suspicion. The city of LA even had to pay him for all the damages. A key detail learned during this trial was that Dillon was actually in San Francisco during the date of January 15th, so it could not possibly be him. Now, a lot of people seem to claim that Leslie Dillon and Mark Hansen knew each other, but there is no evidence of this at all. The connection was only made because he was named a suspect during the grand jury investigation, launched as a result of DeRivers' mishandling of Dillon. All that came of it was a house investigation and a taped recording that revealed nothing involving Hansen, Dillon, or Betty. Leslie Dillon is often considered one of the most likely suspect, but this is clearly from people that either ignore evidence that proved his innocence, or people that never even really looked into him at all. So yeah, once again, this suspect is debunked. The next suspect is one that has become popular over the years, as he wasn't a suspect at the time. This suspect is actually a notable serial killer known as the Lipstick Killer. Yes, in recent years, many people believe that the Lipstick Killer was, in fact, the one behind this. So let's go over why this has become such a popular theory, because it's a pretty complicated one. If you don't know who the Lipstick Killer was, the title is pretty accurate. In Chicago in 1946, 3 women were brutally murdered, with one having a message written in red lipstick. It was an extremely disturbing case, but if you already know about this killer, I'm sure you are questioning something right now, and that is, how could it possibly be the Lipstick Killer if he was arrested in 1946? Being arrested in 1946, this date would obviously make no sense since the tragedy we're discussing happened in 1947. But that's where the theories come in. It's thought of by some people that the person who was arrested wasn't the Lipstick Killer. As of now, this theory most likely sounds like some ridiculous conspiracy, but the case is fairly controversial as to if the person who was actually arrested did the murders. There is evidence for and against this. The man who wound up being arrested and who served the rest of his life in prison was a kid named William Hirons, and he was officially arrested in 1946 when he was just 17. Keep in mind, tensions were high at this time because these killings were quite horrific, and the city of Chicago was demanding justice. With that being said, Hirons was caught after breaking into an apartment and pointing a loaded revolver at the police. The interrogation was unimaginably awful. He was reportedly beaten numerous times during this span and was also not given any food or water for 6 days. He was given a lumbar puncture without any painkillers. He was given the highly controversial truth serum without the consent of his parents, and when under the serum's effect, he claimed that his alter ego, George Merman, may have been responsible for the murders. The press went wild, saying that his persona, Murder Man, had been the Lipstick Killer. He underwent 2 polygraph tests, and they both came back as inconclusive. The thing is, though, is that in the 1953 novel, Lie, Detection, and Criminal Interrogation by John E. Reed and Fred Inbow stated that, on the basis of the conventional testing theory, his response on the card test clearly establishes him as an innocent person. Although, once again, it's worth mentioning that polygraphs are not completely reliable. Other pieces of evidence pointing away from Hirons included his handwriting not matching the lipstick writing, and one person who may have spotted the killer reported the suspect was in his mid-30s. With all that being said though, Hirons was barely an angel. He was a habitual liar and a serial burglar. One of the houses he robbed was awfully close to the third victim, Suzanne Degnan's bedroom. He reportedly knew more about the crimes than a child his age should have known, and his fingerprints were found at one of the victim's houses and on a ransom note. He also definitely fired a gun he stole at a window, wounding a woman, so he was clearly very violent. Innocent or not, William Hirons pled guilty to all 3 murders, resulting in 3 life-term sentences in prison, where he lived the rest of his life until March 5th, 2012, when he passed away. Because of the many controversies in this case, it's not surprising that some people think the actual lipstick killer fled Chicago and LA in 1946 and killed Betty in 1947. At first glance, this theory now makes the timeline more plausible, but in reality, that's the only similarity that is shared here. Besides the time span making sense, there isn't anything that matches between these 2 cases. The victims of the lipstick killer didn't really share anything much in common with the Black Dahlia murder, outside of the last victim being dismembered. Overall, this case just seems too hypothetical for me, because it involves a killer from Chicago fleeing all the way to LA and then taking another victim. I don't know about you, but it just seems a little bit far-fetched. And heck, it's